If you grew up in Britain between 1950 and 1990, there was a brass instrument waiting for you at school. Heavy, cold, slightly dented, with a name stamped into the bell that meant nothing to you at the time: Boosey and Hawkes. Every one of them came from a single factory in North London, where 700 craftsmen produced 1,000 instruments a week. Then, just before Christmas, 1999, auditors discovered that salesmen in a Chicago distribution office had been entering sales that had never happened, £13 million of revenue that existed only on paper, transmitted to London and accepted as real for years because the distance made verification easy to skip. The share price collapsed. The factory, open since 1924, was sold to property developers for £17 million. Today, houses stand where the Sonorous Works once rose. No plaque marks the ground. This is the story of John Boosey, who founded a music lending library in Georgian London, and the 240 years of making that followed, the factory that built Lancaster bomber parts, won the Queen's Award to Industry, and put a brass instrument in the hands of a generation of British children, and how it was ended in the space of a single financial quarter by false numbers entered in an overseas office 4,000 miles away. Not through catastrophe, through a long retreat, until the day a number that wasn't real finished what years of neglect had already begun. Chapter 1. The Lending Library and the Trumpet. The story begins in a small, cramped room somewhere off the Strand, around 1760, with a man whose full dates of birth and death have never been recorded with any certainty. His name was John Boosey. He was of Franco-Flemish descent. He had settled in London during the decade that the influence of Handel was still permeating the concert rooms and coffee houses of the city, that the Vauxhall pleasure gardens were drawing fashionable crowds to hear the music of Arna and Boyce in the open summer air, that the piano, still called the fortepiano, was beginning its slow displacement of the harpsichord from the parlours of people with sufficient money to own either. John Boosey understood money. More precisely, he understood its absence and what that absence did to people's relationship with culture. Music, for Londoners who wanted to play or sing at home, was expensive. Not the hearing of it, which the pleasure gardens and the pleasure-seeking of Georgian public life made relatively accessible, but the owning of it, the printed score that allowed a family to perform an Italian aria or a German dance at their own keyboard. Those scores cost more than most households could bear to spend. Books, for decades, had been available to borrow from the circulating libraries that dotted the city. John Boosey saw no reason why music should be different. His lending library was a modest affair. Printed scores, rented out by the week, returned and rented again. The paper softening at the corners from repeated handling. The titles running the full range of what educated London wanted in its drawing rooms. Italian opera reductions, German keyboard works, the bright new symphonies arriving from Vienna. The business was small, logical, and quietly democratic. It gave access to a culture that money, for most people, had placed just out of reach. There is something fitting, looking back, in the fact that the firm whose instruments would put music in the hands of a generation of schoolchildren across Britain began by putting music in the hands of people who couldn't afford to buy it. His son Thomas extended the library, and the next generation extended it further. Then Thomas Boosey Jr., who arrived to manage the firm from premises at 4 Old Bond Street in the early decades of the 19th century, saw something more ambitious in what his family had built. The music he most wanted to publish was being written not in London, but in Vienna, Milan, Naples, and Paris. Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, Verdi, Hummel, Mercadante, the most thrilling composers of the age, producing works that London audiences were hungry to own and to play at their own pianos. And the legal position, as Thomas Boosey Jr. understood it, was clear. Copyright protections were a domestic matter. What a foreign composer had published abroad could be republished in Britain by any English firm that cared to do it. For 3 decades, this worked brilliantly. The Boosey catalogues grew thick with Italian opera transcriptions and German piano reductions. The firm built its reputation and its revenues as the publisher of continental genius for an English market that couldn't get enough of it. It was a culturally prestigious and commercially comfortable position. Then 1854 arrived, and the House of Lords stripped it all away. The case was Boosey versus Jeffreys. The Lords ruled in terms that left no room for manoeuvre, that British publishers held no exclusive rights over works by foreign composers published abroad. every continental score that Boosey had imported and republished, the Rossini and Bellini and Donizetti on which the firm had built its mid-century reputation, was now legally available to any rival printer who cared to copy it. A business model carefully constructed over 30 years vanished in an afternoon of legal argument. What you do with a catastrophe of that scale tells you everything about a company's character. Thomas Boosey Jr. did not close the business, did not retreat, did not reduce himself to a smaller ambition. He pivoted, and the direction he pivoted in would, within 2 generations, transform the Boosey name from a publisher of other people's music into the maker of the instruments on which a nation learned to play. In 1851, the firm had already taken a tentative first step into woodwind manufacture. In 1856, a collaboration with the flautist R.S. Pratton produced new flute designs, practical musicians involved from the beginning, not as endorsers but as working partners who brought the requirements of actual playing into the workshop. And then, in 1868, the decisive move, for £9,700, a very serious sum, Boosey and Company purchased the business of Henry Distin. Distin was a maker. His firm had done more than almost any other to popularise the Saxhorn family in England. Those upright, valved brass instruments developed by Adolphe Sax in Paris that were transforming the sound of every military and civilian band in the country. The purchase brought workshops, tools, stock, trained workers, and decades of accumulated knowledge. It also came with a clause that reveals exactly how much both parties understood was at stake. Henry Distin was contractually prohibited from manufacturing instruments under his own name within 100 miles of London, a territorial exclusion built into the transaction, £9,700 to buy the knowledge, and a clause to ensure it couldn't walk straight back out of the door the following morning. The Boosey firm had bought itself into brass. What it needed now was the engineer who could make that investment count. David James Blakely joined the Boosey workshop in 1859. He was, in modern terminology, an acoustician, someone who understood the physics of how instruments worked rather than merely the craft of how they were made, who could approach a long-standing problem in instrument design not by intuition alone, but by calculation, by measurement, by the rigorous application of what the air inside a brass tube was actually doing. The problem he addressed had been irritating brass players since valved instruments were invented. It was the problem of intonation. A valved brass instrument, a cornet, a euphonium, a tuba, works by directing the player's air through different lengths of tubing to produce different pitches. Open the valve, and the air takes the short route. Depress the valve, and it diverts through an extra length of tubing, lowering the note. The mathematics, however, is unforgiving in a specific and practical way. When multiple valves are depressed simultaneously, the resulting combined pitch is slightly, but audibly, wrong. The tubing lengths do not add up correctly. The instrument plays some notes satisfyingly true and others perceptibly flat, because the physical geometry of combining 2 or 3 valve lengths together doesn't produce the exact result that the physics of pitch requires. For the brass band world of Victorian England, this was not a theoretical question. It was the difference between a band that sounded right and one that didn't, in front of a competitive audience that very much knew the difference. The National Brass Band Championships had been running since 1853. Hundreds of works bands, colliery bands, Salvation bands and mill bands competed annually. The movement had its own press, its own star conductors, its own fierce loyalties and deeper rivalries, and every serious bandsman wanted an instrument that played true. In 1874, Blakely solved it. His compensating valve system, patented that year, refined in the years that followed, used a set of small additional compensating loops built into the valve mechanism itself, automatically correcting for the cumulative pitch errors that occurred whenever multiple valves were used together. The instrument adjusted its own intonation as it was played. No additional effort from the player, no compromise. The mathematics, at last, came out right. British brass bands adopted the system with remarkable unanimity. British instrument makers followed. Today, 150 years after Blakely sat in the Boosey workshop and worked out his solution, the compensating valve system remains the standard design on British brass instruments. There is no higher tribute to an engineering solution than that it becomes invisible, so thoroughly correct that no one has found cause to improve on it. Blakely published his findings in the Proceedings of the Musical Association and the Philosophical Magazine. He gave evidence to committees. He kept, as good engineers do, largely to his bench and his calculations. His son Arthur would succeed him as factory manager at the Edgware works in 1918, developing in the 1930s the hydraulic expansion process for forming the complex bows and curves of brass tubing, a method that reduced inconsistency and cracking and brought a new precision to the shapes that the workshop could produce. Two Blakeleys, father and son, a dynasty of quietly brilliant engineers sustaining the intellectual integrity of an instrument-making operation that never put their names on the bells of the instruments they made possible. That is the particular fate of the engineer, and the particular debt the craftsman owes to the person with the calculation pad. The world they were serving by the final decades of the 19th century was one that is difficult to fully comprehend from this distance. The brass band in Britain was not a niche interest or an enthusiast's hobby. It was a mass cultural institution, rooted in the industrial communities of the North and Midlands, in the mining valleys of South Wales, in the dockyards and shipyards and railways. Thousands of bands, works bands attached to cotton mills, colliery bands in the coalfields, salvation bands in the expanding urban missions, school bands, civic bands, regimental bands. The great autumn contests at Bellevue, Manchester, drew crowds that modern concerts do not rival. The movement had celebrity conductors. It had its own stars, its own scandals, its own passionate press, and it needed instruments, reliably made, reliably maintained, deliverable at scale, affordable enough for the institutions and local councils and works owners who funded the bands to buy them. Beyond the civilian world, there was the military. The British Army, in the decades of the Empire's greatest reach, maintained military bands in regiments posted across every continent: India, Canada, South Africa, Australia, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean. Wherever a battalion was stationed, a band was expected to play. The instruments those bands required had to come from somewhere. Boosey and Company, with its compensating valves and its Diston-acquired brass wind expertise, knew exactly where from. By 1874, the firm had made another statement, moving the central offices to 295 Regent Street, not a workshop address, not a Soho thoroughfare, but Regent Street itself, the avenue that Nash had designed as an imperial gesture and that London's finest retailers had transformed into the most prestigious commercial street in the country, was not primarily a geographical decision. It was an announcement. The number 295 would remain the London address of Boosey, and then Boosey and Hawkes for 131 years. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, a different kind of musician was arriving at similar conclusions through a different route. William Henry Hawkes was, in the most literal sense, the man who played the fanfares. Queen Victoria's state trumpeter, the person who announced the sovereign at coronations, at state openings, at the great formal ceremonies by which the most powerful empire in the world marked its own continuity. He stood at the musical threshold of state occasions, and he understood, from that particular vantage point, exactly what a brass instrument needed to do. It needed to work. Immediately, reliably, beautifully, in front of an audience that included royalty and parliament and half the world's press. He started his business in 1860, importing instruments from Cumberland Street, Pimlico. By 1862, he had moved to Soho Square. By 1869, a repair shop is a masterclass in instrument design, because every failure comes back to your bench for you to diagnose and remedy. By 1875, he was in Leicester Square. A partnership with the French bandmaster Jules Rivière, operating as Rivière and Hawkes, added manufacturing to importing and repair. By 1889, the formal designation W. H. Hawkes and Son. By 1895, Denman Street, Piccadilly Circus, and the firm that had started as one royal musician's secondary venture was a significant manufacturer, exporting across the British military and civilian market, with a particular expertise in exactly the kinds of instruments that military bands required. Ralph Hawkes was born in 1898. He would inherit both the firm and its instincts. The practical musician's understanding of what players actually needed, the manufacturer's eye for scale, and something additional that the father's generation had not possessed, an internationalist's restlessness, a hunger for the world beyond the brass band field and the military procurement office. But that ambition was still forming, in 1900, in a boy of 2. The two firms, Boosey and Hawkes, existed in a state of productive rivalry, each serving overlapping markets, each aware of the other. The Depression, still 30 years away, would change the arithmetic of that rivalry considerably, and it was about to bring them to the same table. Chapter 2. Two Rivals, One Vision. By the early 1920s, the instrument trade that Boosey and Hawkes had each grown to dominate was showing the first signs of the pressure that would shortly become acute. The Great War had taken men from workshops and bands alike. The post-war years brought a tentative recovery, but the social landscape of Britain was shifting in ways that manufacturers and publishers could feel, even if they could not yet quantify. The working-class communities that had sustained the brass band movement through the Victorian era were beginning their long relationship with the wireless, with the cinema, with new forms of popular entertainment that competed quietly and then less quietly for the same attention that the band room had once commanded without competition. Ralph Hawkes, barely 20 when the war ended, fully responsible for the family firm within a very few years of returning, was not the kind of man to let this circumstance arrive at his door while he waited behind it. He was 32 years old in 1930, and already, by every account, the more dynamic personality of the two firm principals. Where Leslie Boosey, born in 1887 and bearing the weight of a family name that had defined British music publishing for over a century, operated with the considered caution of institutional responsibility, Ralph Hawkes moved with the restlessness of someone who had decided that the future was larger than the present, and who intended to be there first. In 1924, he commissioned a new factory, not a workshop in central London, not an extension of the existing Denman Street premises, not a conversion of a nearby industrial building, a purpose-built manufacturing facility on Deansbrook Road in Edgware, what was then, in 1924, the semi-rural northern margin of Middlesex, the Edgware Brook and the Deansbrook Stream, running alongside land that the tube extension would soon begin to surround with residential avenues and post-war semis. The site was large enough for multiple buildings, large enough for internal roads, for proper production flow, for the kind of volume that a modern manufacturing operation required. This was a young man's gamble, and it was a large one. Ralph Hawkes had not yet consolidated his inheritance. The Hawkes firm did not yet have the order books to justify a factory of this scale. He was building for the volume he expected to come, not the volume that currently existed, and he was doing it while the Depression was still a few years away, still invisible in the optimistic mid-1920s, still something that no one in a Piccadilly Circus office had reason to anticipate. The factory opened in 1925, on Deansbrook Road, where the former Great Northern Railway line ran nearby and where the streets of North London were being extended, house by house and avenue by avenue, into what had been market gardens and open fields. Ralph Hawkes had put his firm's capital into the ground, and now he had to fill the building. In the offices of the Performing Rights Society, meanwhile, the conversation with Leslie Boosey was deepening. The PRS had been established in 1914 to manage the performance rights of British composers and publishers, to ensure that a song performed in a theatre or a ballroom generated income for the person who had written it and the firm that had published it. By the mid-1920s, it had become a significant institution, and its board included most of the major names in British music publishing. Leslie Boosey sat on it. Ralph Hawkes sat on it. They were, in the nature of such boards, required to discuss things together. Licensing terms, distribution arrangements, the shared problems of the industry. It is a pleasingly ironic origin for a merger. Two rivals who came together in an institution designed to protect creative work. The Performing Rights Society existed to ensure that composers were fairly rewarded. The union it facilitated between their publishers would, within 2 decades, put those composers' music in the hands of every serious musician in the world. The logic was inescapable, and both men were too commercially clear-eyed to ignore it. Their firms served the same market. The Depression was tightening. Unemployment in Britain passed 2 million in 1930 and was still rising. The working families who had sustained the brass band movement through the Victorian and Edwardian years were under severe financial pressure. The military procurement budgets that had sustained the export trade were contracting. Fighting a competition between two firms of similar scale for a shrinking market, at a time of national economic crisis, It made no sense. It made no sense to Leslie Boosey, the cautious institutional man. It made no sense to Ralph Hawkes, the restless internationalist. And in October 1930, Boosey and Hawkes was formed. The Hawkes and Son operation transferred from Denman Street to join the Boosey staff at 295 Regent Street. Between 1931 and 1932, the Boosey manufacturing operation, previously based at Frederick Mews, Stanhope Place near Marble Arch, was moved to Edgware. The factory that Ralph Hawkes had built before the merger now had the combined production requirements of both firms. He had, it turned out, built it exactly the right size. On January 1st, 1933, the last remaining Hawkes and Son instruments were given Boosey and Hawkes serial numbers. The Boosey and Company serial sequence, stretching back into the workshops of the 1850s, a continuous penciled record of every instrument the firm had produced, was retained and extended. That chain of numbers, unbroken across 80 years of making, would eventually be transferred to the archive collections of the Horniman Museum. A researcher today, holding a B and H instrument in any condition, can trace it through that sequence back to the Victorian craftsmen who shaped the first instruments in the range. The record of making long outlasted the making itself. Chapter 3. What Ralph Hawkes made. The merger that was signed in October 1930 was, on paper, a straightforward commercial consolidation. Two firms with overlapping markets and complementary operations combining to reduce costs and survive a difficult decade. That is the version a business press reporter would have filed, and it would have been technically accurate. It was not, however, what Ralph Hawkes intended for what came next. He was 32. He was energetic in a way that the institutional world of British music had not quite seen before in this context. Not the energy of a workshop craftsman perfecting his technique, or a musician deepening his interpretive gifts, but the energy of someone who had looked at the international map of serious music and seen a prize that required speed and nerve to secure. The British military band market, the brass band competitions, the school hire schemes, he understood their value. He intended to maintain them. But they were not what kept Ralph Hawkes awake at night. What kept him awake was the thought of the great European publishing catalogues, the music of the age, already written or being written right now, that would be performed in concert halls for the next 2 centuries, and that would generate royalties for as long as those performances continued. He began with what he already had. By the time of the merger, B&H had acquired agencies for Belayev, the great Russian publisher, and for Edition Russe de Musique and Gutheil, catalogues that carried within them the heritage of the 19th century Russian tradition. They were properties of potential value rather than immediate income. Ralph Hawkes held them and waited. Then, in the spring of 1938, the Anschluss arrived. When Nazi Germany annexed Austria in March of that year, the consequences for Viennese musical culture were immediate and devastating. Universal Edition, the great Viennese publisher of modernist music, home to Berg and Webern and Schönberg, champion of the most challenging and most important contemporary composition in the world, was suddenly operating under a regime that considered its catalogue degenerate and many of its principal staff Jewish. The city that had been the centre of European musical modernism was, overnight, hostile to the music that had made it famous. Ralph Hawkes moved with a speed that the moment demanded. B&H secured the rights to Bartók and to Kodály, 2 composers whose work would have been intolerable to the new Austrian order and whose futures as viable publishing properties under the Anschluss were approximately 0. More significantly, Hawkes made contact with the displaced staff of Universal Edition, and in particular with a man named Ernst Roth. Ernst Roth had been one of the intellectual engines of Viennese music publishing, a scholar-editor of the old European tradition, fluent in the musical culture of the continent, possessed of a network of relationships with composers, conductors, and institutions that represented decades of careful cultivation. He was Jewish. He was in Vienna in 1938. Ralph Hawkes brought him to London. It was, by any measure, an act of commercial clarity that was simultaneously an act of decency. Roth came to Regent Street and became, over the following decade, the editorial backbone of the B&H publishing operation. His presence there, his knowledge, his relationships, his ability to read the musical landscape of a continent in upheaval, would deliver Boosey and Hawkes its most valuable acquisitions. In 1943, working through the networks that Hawkes had been building since the early years of the merged firm. B&H secured the operatic publishing rights of Richard Strauss. The arrangement covered performances outside Germany and Italy, where Strauss's own arrangements were in place, but it was an extraordinary acquisition nonetheless. Arabella, Capriccio, and Via letzte Lieder, the four last songs, written in the final years of a life that had spanned the Romantic tradition and every revolution that followed it. 4 songs for soprano and orchestra, composed in the composer's mid-80s, full of evening light and the particular acceptance of someone who has said everything they needed to say and is now, beautifully and without regret, preparing to stop. They entered the B&H catalogue in 1943. They have been performed, recorded, and wept at ever since. By the time the war ended, Ralph Hawkes was spending a significant portion of his time in New York. He understood, with the instincts of someone who had been reading the transatlantic music industry for 20 years, that the center of gravity was shifting westward, that the American concert hall, the American recording industry, and the American market for serious contemporary music represented a future that could not be managed effectively from London alone. He worked it personally. He was there, meeting people, understanding the landscape. In 1947, he signed Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky was, by any measure, the most consequential living composer in the world. The Rite of Spring premiered in Paris in May 1913 at a performance so controversial that members of the audience fought each other in the aisles before the piece was finished, had permanently altered the possibilities of orchestral music. The works that followed it had sustained a career of unbroken creative ambition across 4 decades. Petrushka, The Firebird, Symphony of Psalms, The Rake's Progress. If you attempted to explain what serious music in the 20th century meant and why it mattered, you could not avoid his name. Ralph Hawkes brought him to Boosey Hawkes. The same year, 1947, Hawkes purchased the edition Rus de Musique and Gutteil catalogues outright from the estate of Serge Koussevitzky. The holdings those catalogues contained were staggering. The Stravinsky ballets, The Rite of Spring, Petrushka, Prokofiev's Classical Symphony, Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, and Ravel's celebrated orchestration of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an exhibition. A single transaction and several of the most frequently performed orchestral works in the world were Boosey Hawkes' properties. The list grew. Aaron Copland, whose fanfare for the common man and Appalachian Spring had made him America's most beloved serious composer, was a B&H composer. Leonard Bernstein, whose West Side Story would become the most successful musical theatre work of the 20th century, was a B&H composer. And Benjamin Britten, whom Hawkes had championed early, often against the rest of the board, in the teeth of institutional caution, had his greatest vindication in the summer of 1945. Peter Grimes opened at Sadler's Wells on 7th June 1945, the first new production the company had mounted since the end of the European War. The audience that night left the theatre in something approaching silence. Not cold silence, but moved silence. The kind that falls when people have experienced something they need a moment to understand before they can respond to it. Hawkes had been right. The man he had backed when his colleagues were doubtful. The composer he had protected when the board was unconvinced had announced himself as the most important British composer since Elgar, and his music was a Boosey Hawkes property. The publishing catalogue that Boosey Hawkes controlled by 1950 was the most valuable collection of serious contemporary music in the world. It was not close. Stravinsky, Britten, Prokofiev, Rachmaninoff, Bartók, Copland, Bernstein, Richard Strauss. These were not obscure properties awaiting discovery. They were the works that orchestras programmed every season, that conductors competed to record, that audiences paid to hear on every continent where a concert hall had been built. The royalty streams they generated were substantial and growing, and they had been assembled, in the most remarkable way, by one man working across 2 decades of war and displacement, buying rights from Jewish refugees and American conductors' estates and desperate European publishers, stitching together a catalogue with the instincts of someone who had heard the future and moved toward it. The factory, meanwhile, was doing something less glamorous, but no less essential. During the war, the Edgware plant had been seconded, as almost every British manufacturing facility of any scale had been seconded, to military production. The workers who had been shaping brass into cornets and euphoniums and tubas turned their hands to other shapes. The workshop that had been forming the bodies of woodwind instruments made, in its wartime incarnation, components for the aircraft that were fighting the most consequential air war in history: wings, Lancaster bomber elevator assemblies, bomb doors configured for the 4,000-pound bomb carrier versions of the Lancaster. In the pipe shop, where, in peacetime, the delicate inner tubing of woodwind instruments had been cut and fitted, workers manufactured 250,000 pipes for Lancaster aircraft, 250,000. The same hands, the same skills, the same knowledge of metal at precise tolerances. The difference between a note in tune and one that isn't is a matter of fractions of a millimetre, and the difference between a component that holds and one that fails is measured in similar fractions, with considerably higher stakes. The Edgware workers didn't need to be taught what precision meant. It was what they did. Limpet mines were assembled in other departments. Sticky bombs, documented in wartime photographs that survive in the Horniman archive, showing women workers at the assembly tables, were produced by the same workforce that, when the war was over, returned to making the instruments that schoolchildren would be handed for the next 50 years. The factory made music, then it made weapons, then it made music again, and the figures that followed tell, in the most compact possible form, what the post-war period meant for Edgware. Between 1946 and 1954, Boosey and Hawkes produced an average of 3,292 brass instruments per year. In the 5 years from 1955 to 1959, that average rose to 22,176. 7 times. The same factory, the same site on Deansbrook Road, the same North London workforce, and 7 times the output within a decade. The pent-up demand of the post-war years, the expansion of school music programs, the growth of the amateur brass band movement, the increased availability of hire purchase arrangements that brought instruments within reach of families who could not have bought them outright. All of this converged on the Edgware factory. And it was ready because Ralph Hawkes had built it big enough. He did not live to see the full flowering of what he had made. Ralph Hawkes died suddenly on the 8th of September 1950. He was 52 years old. Before his death, tensions had developed in his relationship with Leslie Boosey, the factions that form in long partnerships when the two principals have begun, privately, to want different things. It emerged after Hawkes's death that he had borrowed £100,000 of company capital during the war without the required approval of the exchange control authorities. Leslie Boosey absorbed the consequences at considerable personal cost. It emerged, too, that Hawkes had been harbouring a private ambition to separate the publishing arm from the instrument business, to take the Stravinsky and Britten catalogue to New York, where he believed its future lay, and to leave Boosey in London with the factory and the brass bands. The instruments, Ralph Hawkes had apparently concluded, were dull. He died before he could act on it. But the thought, the idea that the publishing and the manufacturing were two different things, two different futures, two different valuations, did not die with him. It waited. His brother Geoffrey assumed control of the Hawkes faction within the firm. The contrast was not flattering. Where Ralph had been a force of commercial nature, restless, brilliant, constructive, Geoffrey was, as the record suggests with some diplomatic understatement, considerably less reliable. Money was spent. The specific projects and ventures on which it was spent have not been fully accounted for in the public record, but the pattern is clear enough. The intellectual and commercial rigour that had built the publishing empire departed with Ralph, and what the Hawkes succession brought in its place was something smaller and less disciplined. Leslie Boosey, who had met Ralph on the board of the PRS and married their firm's fortunes together, who had cleared the exchange control debt from his own pocket, who had spent his career building one of the great cultural institutions of 20th century Britain, was now in his 60s, managing the aftermath of a partnership that had outlived its most dynamic principle. The works on Deansbrook Road, though, was about to enter its greatest period. 700 workers, 1,000 instruments a week, a name stamped into bells that would end up in school stockrooms from Inverness to Penzance. The factory was not dull, was not. Whatever Ralph Hawkes may have thought from his New York office, the factory was magnificent. They called it the Sonorous Works. Chapter 4. The Sonorous Works. You smelled it before you saw it. Walking along Deansbrook Road on a weekday morning in 1965, with the Edgware Brook running alongside in its concrete channel and the residential avenues of North London stretching away on both sides, You would have encountered the smell first, a compound of brass swarf and solder flux, and the particular metallic warmth of a building in which hot work was continuously being done, drifting out through the ventilation openings and settling over the street with the settled authority of something that had been there for decades and had every intention of remaining. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of making, the smell of material being transformed by heat and pressure and skilled hands into something that had not previously existed. Then the building came into view, and it announced itself. The Sonorous Works. The name was there on the building itself, not a modest trade designation, not a stenciled address on a brickwork gatepost, but a declaration in the confident lettering of a firm that understood what it was and intended you to understand it too. The Sonorous Works. They had named the building after the quality of what it produced, where other factories named themselves for their founders or their streets or their products in plain descriptive terms. The people at Deansbrook Road had chosen to name theirs for sound, for the particular quality of sound that a well-made brass instrument produces, the depth and resonance and carrying power that makes a euphonium played in the open air carry across a field without effort, that makes a cornet in a concert hall fill the space to its furthest corner. The Sonorous Works. A factory that understood it was building something more than metal. At the entrance gate, since 1948, there had been a sentinel, an 8-foot tuba, an instrument of extraordinary scale, twice the height of the tallest worker walking through the gates beneath it, broad and brassy and imperious, moved from its previous position on the Besson Wall in Euston Road to stand at the threshold of the Edgware site when the Besson operation was consolidated here. It faced the road. It faced every person arriving at the beginning of every shift. It was, without qualification or self-consciousness, a statement about the scale of what this factory aspired to produce. Not the small and the intimate, but the large, the resonant, the architecturally ambitious. You are entering a place that makes the biggest brass instruments in the world. Whatever you are doing when you walk through these gates, you are participating in something worth doing. Inside the gates, the site opened out into a series of buildings connected by yards and internal roads. Not a single hall, but a collection of interconnected workshops, each given to a stage or category of the manufacturing process, the product moving through them in stages, the way a piece of music moves through its development, accumulating complexity and character as it goes. The raw material arrived as sheet, brass in the specific copper-zinc alloy that the factory's quality had been built on, soft, high in copper content, genuinely malleable, the kind of material that yields to forming without cracking and springs back to shape when the pressure is removed. In the best years, the material that arrived at Deansbrook Road was exactly what the process required. The shop floor had ways of knowing whether it was right. Experienced hands could feel the difference between brass that was properly annealed and ready for drawing, and brass that had been worked too hard and would resist the die with the consistency, as one veteran would later put it, with the sourness of someone describing a betrayal of a Coca-Cola can. The drawing shop was where tubes were made, the machines that Arthur Blakely's father had designed for drawing metal through dies to specific bore dimensions, precise to fractions of a millimeter, because bore diameter is the fundamental determinant of an instrument's acoustic character, pulled the brass through in a single sustained movement, the tube emerging longer and thinner and truer than what had entered. The sound of drawing, a low, mechanical persistence, the metal giving way with the particular resistance of something reluctant but unavoidably compliant. The bell shop was where the character of the instrument announced itself. Bell making was skilled work in the specific, observable sense that the result was immediately and audibly present in the finished instrument. A bell that had been correctly spun and formed would sing when it was tapped, a clear, sustained ring that the trained ear could assess without instruments. Dennis Wedgwood, who arrived at the Edgware factory as a 17-year-old and would return across decades of his working life, described in a written account of his first visit the sound that reached him before he had entered the building. Bell-making department, emanating Unvillian chimes that would have inspired Verdi and Wagner. The phrase earns its preservation. The sound of bells being formed on their lathes, the rhythmic ring of a spinning mandrel, the particular resonance of copper-zinc alloy in motion, the half-musical chiming of metal being shaped by hand, was the sonic signature of the Sonorous Works. Not noise, not the chaotic industrial racket of a foundry. The sound of instruments being made, which is itself a musical sound, if you have ears for it. The pressing department shaped the valve casings, the complex cylindrical chambers that the pistons would fit with the close tolerances that the instrument's playability depended upon. Arthur Blakely's hydraulic expansion process, developed in the 1930s, formed the bows and curves of the tubing, the U-shaped sections that directed the air column back on itself in the multiple loops of a euphonium or tuba, without the cracking and inconsistency that earlier methods had produced. The presses worked with a vibration that the whole building conducted. A low rhythmic percussion felt through the soles of the feet as much as heard, the building's own contribution to the soundscape of making. Between operations, the metal had to be annealed, heated in furnaces to a specific temperature, and then cooled, restoring to the brass the malleability that the forming process had worked out of it. Bright metal going in, bright metal coming out, but softened now, ready for the next stage. The furnaces added warmth to the air of the brass shop, a gentle ambient heat that was present even in winter, the building generating its own climate. Soldering joined the components. Flux and tin-lead solder, applied with irons that hissed and spat a little when they touched the joint, releasing a smell, tin and flux and the faint sulphurous edge of burned impurity that was, for anyone who worked in the brass shop, as inseparable from the job as the tools themselves. The smell of solder was the smell of construction, of the work advancing. It was the smell of assembly nearing completion. Valve fitting was where the tolerances came to their final test. The pistons, machined to slide within the valve casings with a smoothness that only worked within a very narrow band of dimensional accuracy, were fitted by workers whose hands understood the feeling of correct fit the way a locksmith's hands understand the feeling of a key turning cleanly. In the best years of the factory, the pistons were made from monel metal, a high nickel alloy of exceptional durability, resistant to corrosion, smooth in operation, the kind of material that 30 years of daily playing would not significantly degrade. It was the right material for a component that would be worked by a musician's hand perhaps 10,000 times in a single hour of serious practice. Later, and the word later in this context carries a weight it doesn't carry elsewhere, the decision would be made to use stainless steel instead. It was cheaper. The consequences of that decision belong to a later chapter of this story. The polishing and lacquering department processed the assembled instruments before they left the building. The lacquer, solvent-based, sharp in the nostrils with a petroleum-adjacent edge that cut through the metallic warmth of the rest of the workshop, was applied to protect the brass from tarnish. The smell of lacquer meant the instrument was nearly finished. The smell of lacquer was the smell of an instrument that was almost an instrument, one step short of the moment when it would first be played. Engraving added the final marks of identity. The instrument books, continuous records kept since at least November 1939, recorded the names of individual engravers beside each serial number. A craftsman marking the bell of a regent cornet with the model name and the company designation was, without necessarily thinking of it this way, inscribing the instrument into a record that's stretching back through the Victorian workshops and forward to the Horniman Museum, where those books now sit. And then the instruments were tested. Not simply examined, played, by musicians who knew what the instrument should sound like and were qualified to identify when it didn't. Jack Brymer, principal clarinet of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, a player of international standing who had recorded with the most respected conductors in the world, was documented as one of the testers. His correspondence survives in the museum archive. Postcards to Eric McGavin, notes exchanged between a professional musician of the first rank and the factory's in-house curator, the two men talking instruments across the ordinary post. The connection between professional performance at the highest level and the Edgware production line was not incidental, it was deliberate. The instruments leaving Deansbrook Road were tested by people who knew what a great instrument felt like in the hands. Eric McGavin warrants his own pause in the story. He was the firm's education advisor and museum curator, a title that, in the middle decades of the 20th century, most factories of comparable size simply didn't have. McGavin maintained within the Edgware buildings a collection of historic instruments that he had developed, through the 1950s and 1960s, into a serious educational resource. Not a display cabinet, an active collection used. School groups came from across North London and beyond to tour the factory and see the instruments. Researchers visited, performers came to study. A photograph survives of McGavin demonstrating a cornu, the ancient Roman military horn, curved and unwieldy and magnificent, to students at Hemel Hempstead Grammar School, circa 1960, a museum curator from a North London factory, taking the instruments of antiquity to a classroom 20 miles away, showing children what 2,000 years of music making had looked like before it became what it was now. That was what Eric McGavin did, and it was not considered unusual. It was considered part of what the Sonorous Works was. The factory was a cultural institution. The people who ran it knew this, and they acted accordingly. Chapter 5. The Regent and the Schoolroom. The worker who described his years at the Sonorous Works in an online forum in 2006 said it simply: his father had worked at Edgware for 50 years. He himself had worked there from 1982, 2 generations. Half a century of a man's life in the brass shop and woodmill and valve fitting department, followed by the son coming through the gates on his own account. The sentence carries the weight of something more than employment statistics. 50 years and 20 years. 3/4 of a century of one family's working life put into the Deansbrook Road buildings, into the instruments, into the particular knowledge of what the metal needed and when it was ready, and how you could tell if a valve fit was correct, without measuring it because your hands already knew. Multi-generational employment at the Sonorous Works was not unusual. It was the pattern. Fathers brought sons. Mothers brought daughters. The knowledge that couldn't be written in instruction manuals, the feel of properly annealed brass under the spinner's tool, the sound of a bell that had been formed correctly versus one that needed another pass, moved through families and between experienced workers and new apprentices in the way that all genuine craft knowledge moves, by proximity, by demonstration, by the long accumulation of hours doing the work alongside someone who already knew it. Dennis Wedgwood had first visited the factory as a 17-year-old player, arriving with the particular alertness of someone who loved instruments and wanted to understand how they were made. The bell-making shop had announced itself from outside, those Anvillian chimes carrying down the road. Inside, the complexity of the operation struck him. Not just the noise and the warmth and the smell, but the density of skill involved at every stage, the number of separate operations that stood between a brass sheet and a finished instrument, each one requiring its own specific knowledge to do correctly. He would return across the years, and the comparison between what he found on early visits and what he found in the final decade before closure told a story that the production statistics alone could not fully convey. But in the golden years, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, what Wedgwood found at Deansbrook Road was an operation working at the full extent of its designed purpose. 700 workers, 1,000 instruments a week leaving the gates, crated and labelled and addressed to customers in 125 countries. The product range was arranged across 3 tiers, each one calibrated to a different market and a different relationship with music. The Regent was the bottom of the range, and the word bottom carries no meaningful diminishment here, because the bottom of the B and H range was built to standards that most manufacturers of the era couldn't match at any tier. A Regent cornet or euphonium was heavy, noticeably, physically heavy, the kind of weight that a 7-year-old feels in the arms after 20 minutes of holding a playing position. It was indestructible in the practical sense. The brass that went into it was thick enough that the ordinary violence inflicted on school instruments, the dropped case, the careless storage, the handling by children who were yet to learn the care that instruments repay, simply bounced off it. The valves worked. The intonation was correct, because the compensating valve system that Blakely had designed 100 years earlier was standard across the range. A Regent was not a fine instrument in the sense that a sovereign was fine, but it was honest. It did exactly what it was designed to do, and what it was designed to do was to introduce a generation of British children to brass music. The mechanism that delivered Regent instruments into school stockrooms across Britain was the Local Education Authority hire scheme. From the post-war years through the 1970s, LEAs equipped their schools with B and H instruments, bought outright for the stockroom, or hired out to pupils on a weekly or termly basis. The weekly fee, modest enough that most families could manage it even when buying the instrument outright, was beyond them. The hire purchase arrangement was, in its quiet way, the same democratic instinct that John Boosey had brought to his music lending library in the 1760s. Music is expensive, but access to music need not be. You rent the instrument. You return it if it doesn't suit. The dents it already carries were made by someone else's child. The dents your child makes will be inherited by the next. A Regent instrument from 1974, purchased new, smelled of the lacquering department it came from. Cold, a little chemical. The valve oil that had been applied for testing still present when you worked the valves for the first time. The case was black leatherette overboard, the interior lined with pressed velvet in a shade that varied by year. The accessories, the mouthpiece, the cleaning rod, the small bottle of oil, tucked into their own shaped recesses. The instrument itself weighed slightly more than felt comfortable, and its resistance to the breath was slightly higher than the finest instruments, which was not entirely a disadvantage. A player who learned on a Regent developed the lung support and embouchure strength that a better instrument would later reward. Every generation of British brass musicians who played between 1950 and 1990 passed through this experience. Not all of them. Music education was never universal. Funding was uneven across authorities. Some schools had better provision than others. But the Regent and its school hire chain meant that the proportion of British children who had held a B and H instrument in their hands, who had learned their first scale on a Regent cornet, or struggled with the weight of a Regent euphonium in a Tuesday afternoon music lesson, was enormous. It was a generational memory. The cold brass smell of the stockroom, the slightly dented bell that someone had already dented before you arrived, the teacher saying, "Again, hold it up." The middle tier was the Imperial. Intermediate players, those who had progressed through the student range and were developing toward the serious amateur and lower professional market, moved to the Imperial, which offered significantly improved response and tonal quality. The Imperial EEB-based tuba, in particular, was a mainstay of brass band bottom sections well into the 1970s and beyond, the kind of instrument that a dedicated player would acquire with care and maintain for decades. The top tier was the Sovereign, and the Sovereign deserves its own moment of acknowledgement here. Introduced in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the product of peak-era investment, designed to serve the contesting brass band market at its most competitive, the Sovereign represented the summit of what the Edgware factory was capable of. The finest players in the finest brass bands in Britain played Sovereigns. The best years of the Sovereign, the early 1990s, when the quality was at its highest, would be the years of the factory's decline. There is a particular cruelty in the timing, which will become clear later. The brass band world that these instruments served was, by the 1960s and 1970s, entering a period of genuine artistic ambition. The national championships and the British Open attracted bands of remarkable standard. The movement had its own composing tradition, its own conductors who were serious artists, its own audiences who knew the difference between a performance that was merely accurate and one that was genuinely musical. A Sovereign in the hands of a principal cornetist at a major contesting band was being used to perform music of real sophistication. It was not a toy. It was a professional instrument in the truest sense. And all of it, the Regent in the school stockroom and the Sovereign on the contest stage, was made in the same building, on the same site, by the same workforce, supervised by the same institutional knowledge that stretched back to David Blakely and the compensating valve. Jack Brymer tested clarinets from Edgware and put his observations in postcards to Eric McGavin, the former principal clarinet of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, a musician of international standing, corresponding with a factory curator in North London about the instruments coming off the production line. The connection was not odd. It was exactly what the Sonorous Works believed it was, a place where the highest standards of professional music making and the practical requirements of mass production met, and were not in conflict, because the people running the factory had never accepted that they had to be in conflict. The community that surrounded the factory, the residential streets of Edgware and the adjacent neighbourhoods, was shaped by its presence in the quiet, pervasive way that large employers shape the places they occupy. Families living within walking distance of Deansbrook Road included parents and grandparents who had worked there, whose working week was organised around the shifts, whose social world intersected with the factory through the friendships formed on the floor and sustained in the local pubs and working men's clubs. The factory was the largest employer in the immediate area. Its continued operation was not an economic abstraction for the people who lived nearby. It was the wage packet on a Friday, the family holiday in August, the certainty of what Monday morning would bring. Chapter 6. Half of Regent Street. In 1971, the catalogue that Boosey and Hawkes issued for its woodwind instruments was embossed with the Queen's Award to Industry. The award itself, the formal recognition by the state of a firm whose export achievements had met the highest standard the government applied to such assessments, sat on the cover above the instrument specifications in the quiet way that genuine distinction carries itself, not boasting, stating. The numbers that surrounded that embossed insignia told the story directly. Offices on 6 continents: Bonn, Johannesburg, New York, Paris, Toronto, Sydney. B&H had maintained international presence since the 1950s, and by the early 1970s, those offices were managing export relationships in 125 countries. The British Army took B&H instruments to every corner of the empire it had reached. The post-imperial period saw those relationships maintained through commercial rather than military channels, but maintained they were. In Australia, in Canada, in South Africa, in the Caribbean garrison towns and the Indian subcontinent, the name on the bell meant British quality in the specific, earned sense. Not merely British origin, but British standard. The Regent Street address sustained the other end of this identity. 295 Regent Street had been home to the Boosey firm since 1874, and by the early 20th century, the firm had expanded its presence there considerably. The phrase that eventually attached itself to B&H, that they owned half of Regent Street, was not quite literal, but it pointed at something real. The premises at 295 and the surrounding properties represented a statement of commercial weight that few music publishers in the world could match. The sale room, the showroom, the performance spaces, the publishers' offices, all of it concentrated in the most prestigious commercial street in London. When a serious musician, a conductor, an orchestral manager, or an educational authority buyer arrived at 295 Regent Street, they were not visiting a supplier. They were entering an institution. The acquisitions that had built the instrument-making side of the operation represented their own kind of institutional authority. J.R. Lafleur and Son had come into the B&H orbit in 1917. Besson and Company, the firm that had been producing brass instruments of the highest quality in London since the mid-19th century, whose sovereign equivalent instruments had been bought by the finest players in Britain for generations, had been in formal arrangement with B&H since 1933, with manufacture moved to Edgware from 1948 and full absorption completed on 1st July 1968. From that point, the Besson name joined the Regent Street showroom catalogue, 2 great British instrument-making lineages unified under one roof and one management. Rudolf Carte and Company, the specialist flute makers whose instruments had been among the finest available in Britain for a century, were absorbed into the B&H serial sequence from 1955. The Salvation Army Brass Instrument Factory, which had been producing instruments specifically designed for Salvation Band use, carrying the Army's crest, for decades, was acquired in the late 1960s or early 1970s, with production continuing and the name maintained on the instruments themselves, because the players who used them wanted those instruments, and the Army's identity remained commercially significant within its own market. By 1970, Boosey and Hawkes held an effective monopoly on mass-produced British wind instrument manufacture. The only significant British wind instrument makers operating independently were specialists at the very top of the market. Paxman French horns, founded in 1919, serving the orchestral professional at a level where handcraftsmanship and bespoke specification meant that mass production was not the relevant category. In 1981, the acquisitions extended across the channel. Buffet Crampon, the French woodwind maker, whose clarinets had been among the most sought after in the world for over a century, whose instruments occupied the hands of principal clarinetists in orchestras from Paris to New York, was acquired by B&H that year. Unlike the British acquisitions, Buffet Crampon production was not moved to Edgware. It remained in Paris, in the French workshops, with its own serial number sequence and its own manufacturing identity. The Paris operation was left to do what it did best, because what it did best was too specific and too prestigious to risk disrupting. The logic seemed sound. The instrument range now covered everything from the Regent cornet in the school stockroom to the Buffet R13 clarinet on the professional orchestral stage, with every price point and quality tier in between. Boosey and Hawkes was not merely the largest British wind instrument manufacturer. It was, by any reasonable measurement, the most comprehensive wind instrument manufacturer in the world. Leslie Boosey retired in 1964. He was 77 years old and had spent his entire adult professional life building the firm. First as a member of the family that founded it, then as the managing director who oversaw the merger, then as the co-architect of the publishing empire that made its name synonymous with serious music for half a century. He died in 1979 without an obituary. The newspapers that noted the passing of figures of considerably lesser cultural significance did not find room for the man who had brought Stravinsky and Britten and Prokofiev and Rachmaninoff to the English-speaking world, who had met Ralph Hawkes on a royalty committee and turned that meeting into one of the great cultural institutions of 20th century Britain, who had cleared his late partner's exchange control debts from his own account without public complaint. France had recognized him. He received the Légion d'honneur, the most prestigious French state honor, for his contributions to French musical culture, for ensuring that the great French publishing catalogues were properly represented in British musical life. Britain did not. Every 2 years, the Royal Philharmonic Society and the Performing Rights Society, the institution in which he and Hawkes had first sat down together, present the Leslie Boosey Award to an individual who has contributed to British musical life in ways that rarely attract public attention. The award exists, explicitly, for people who work backstage. There is something precisely right about that, and something quietly devastating. The man who built the firm died without an obituary. His name survives in recognition of people who don't take curtain calls. He would, perhaps, have understood the appropriateness. Chapter 7. The Summit. The early years of the 1970s, by any measure available to us now, represent the absolute highest point. 700 workers at Deansbrook Road, 1,000 instruments leaving the gates every week, the Queen's Award to Industry, offices on 6 continents, the publishing catalogue containing, in full ownership or sole rights agency, several of the most performed works in the classical repertoire, the Regent in 1 million school stockrooms, the Besson Imperial in the bottom sections of contesting brass bands across the country, the Sovereign being designed, the development investment being made, the engineering work being done, for a professional market that would confirm its quality in the decade ahead. The musicians who had grown up with B and H instruments were, by the early 1970s, at the peaks of their own careers. The British orchestral sound, the particular character of British brass and woodwind playing, distinct from the German and French and American sounds in ways that were clearly audible to any trained ear, had been formed in significant part by the instruments that Deansbrook Road had produced across 2 generations, the compensating valve system, the bore dimensions, the specific proportions of the bell flare. These were not incidental details. They were the physical basis of a national musical character, and they had been worked out through the Blakely calculations and the Edgware craftsman's refinements across a century of patient engineering. Standing at this summit in 1972 or 1973, you would not have seen what was coming. That is the nature of summits. The view from the top is horizontally extensive, but vertically deceiving. You can see very far in any direction, but you cannot see the path down from the other side. What was already happening in 1970 gives the period its bittersweet undertone. In that year, the older of the 2 craftsmen who specialized in horn production at Edgware reached retirement age and left. French horn manufacture is among the most technically demanding work in the instrument-making field. The complex conical tubing, the rotary valves, the acoustic demands of an instrument whose entire character depends on the subtle interplay of proportions that takes years to understand fully. When the elder craftsman retired, B&H faced a decision. By 1970, horns represented only a small proportion of the total production, the larger volume being in the more standardized cornet and euphonium lines. The decision was made not to replace him. His knowledge left with him. It was not a decision made maliciously or without logic. From a production planning perspective, the arithmetic was defensible. Specialist craftsmen for a small volume product, when the alternatives were increasingly available from continental manufacturers, were expensive overhead in a period when margins were tightening. The calculation was reasonable. The consequence was the beginning of a long sequence of similar calculations, each individually reasonable, each individually defensible, each one removing a piece of knowledge from the building and replacing it with nothing. The physicist who had worked at Edgware to provide the scientific underpinning that Arthur Blakely and his father had provided across 2 generations, the technical intelligence that kept the factory's decisions grounded in acoustic reality rather than commercial pressure, left around the same time to start a successful instrument company of his own. He was not replaced. The factory's scientific capacity, its ability to evaluate proposed design changes against the physical realities of what they would do to the instrument's behavior, departed with him. And the range, the mind-boggling range, as senior management had begun to describe it in the early 1970s, was becoming a problem that nobody had quite resolved. B&H produced, at its peak, an extraordinary span of products: cornets, flugelhorns, trumpets, French horns, trombones, tenor horns, baritones, euphoniums, tubas, in multiple grades, multiple finishes, multiple bore configurations, alongside a full woodwind range of clarinets, flutes, oboes and bassoons, and the instruments being produced under the Besson name. It was enormous, and the response to enormousness, when management attention was required elsewhere, was to outsource, to bring in instruments made outside Edgware, to source components from German or Indian manufacturers, to reduce the work done on site rather than rationalize the range with the investment that rationalization properly required. From the mid-1970s, the musical instruments division began to be scaled back. The language that appears in the record, less viable to have such an extensive range of products, is the language of the accounts department, arriving at decisions that the engineering department should have been making first. It is quiet language. It contains no drama. It announces no crisis. It was the first sentence of a very long retreat. The Sovereign series was introduced at the turn of the 1980s, the last great product investment that the factory would make, the finest brass instruments that the Edgware production line would ever produce. The best years of the Sovereign, when the quality was at its highest and the instruments coming off the line were genuinely exceptional, were the early 1990s, by which time, as we will see, the factory that made them was already in serious trouble. The finest product and the fading institution were simultaneous. The Sovereign was what the Edgware factory could do at its best, made at the moment when the factory was in the early stages of being unable to do it at all. The horn craftsman retired and was not replaced. The physicist left and was not replaced. The range was described as mind-boggling, and the response was not investment in focused quality, but retreat toward outsourcing. From the mid-1970s, the instruments division was less important than the publishing arm, and the accounts department was beginning to feel that this was an acceptable arrangement. In the brass shop, the workers put in their shifts, and the instruments went out the gates, and the Sovereign was being developed, and nobody said out loud that the summit had been reached. But it had. Chapter 8. The Long Retreat. The first competitor that seriously threatened Boosey and Hawkes did not arrive with the aggression of a rival. It arrived with the quiet, methodical authority of a firm that had decided to be better and had invested the resources to make that decision stick. Yamaha had been making musical instruments in Japan since 1887, but its entry into the international brass and woodwind market in the 1960s was a different kind of event, not the arrival of a heritage maker with a long pedigree, but the calculated expansion of a precision manufacturing operation that had studied the existing market, identified its weaknesses, and designed products to address them with the discipline of a company that did not carry the accumulated habits and compromises of a century of trade. The Yamaha instruments of the mid-1960s were not, in the opinion of many experienced players, the equal of the best British work. But they were consistent in a way that increasingly mattered. Every instrument in a batch played the same way, was finished to the same standard, arrived in the same condition. The tolerances were held. The materials were reliable. The quality control was not the result of skilled hands and long experience, recognizing a deficient instrument before it left the building. It was the result of manufacturing processes designed from the outset to prevent deficiency from occurring. This distinction between quality achieved through individual skill and quality achieved through systematic process would prove, in the decades ahead, to be the distinction that mattered most. Yamaha invested continuously in the tooling and the processes and the material science. B&H had engineers and craftsmen who had built their careers on knowledge that lived in their hands. One of these approaches scales well as volume increases and labor costs rise. The other does not. By the 1980s, Korean manufacturers had entered the lower end of the market. By the 1990s, Chinese production was arriving in volumes that made the economics of the student instrument segment almost impossible for a North London factory operating with British labor costs. The Regent, the instrument that had put music in the hands of a generation of British schoolchildren, was competing at the bottom of the market against instruments that cost a fraction of its manufacturing cost to produce in factories where the economics were entirely different. The school market that had sustained the Regent had also changed. The education funding cuts that arrived in the early 1980s, following the Conservative government's reassessment of local authority expenditure, fell heavily on the kind of discretionary provision that music education represented. Local education authorities that had maintained instrument hire schemes funded peripatetic music teachers, equipped school music rooms with B&H instruments through the post-war decades. These were exactly the institutions that found their budgets reduced and their discretionary programs cancelled first. The Thatcher period did not end school music, but it contracted the infrastructure that had made the B&H model work. The reliable, institutional, authority-funded purchase of instruments in volume, year after year, from the same domestic supplier. That pipeline narrowed, and with it narrowed the guaranteed domestic order book on which the Regent production had depended. Meanwhile, inside the building on Deansbrook Road, a different kind of deterioration was underway. Dennis Wedgwood's account, written in 2006, drawing on decades of direct experience as a player, an instrument maker, and someone who had watched the Edgware operation across the full arc of its golden age and decline, is not the document of someone with a grievance to articulate or a case to prosecute. It is the document of someone who loved what the factory was and was made sorrowful by what it became, and who felt that honesty about the mechanism of its decline was a form of respect for what had been lost. His diagnosis was precise. The problem was not a single catastrophic failure. It was the steady, incremental substitution of short-term cost logic for long-term quality logic. The accounts department arriving at decisions that the engineering department should have been making, and arriving at different answers because it was asking different questions. The valve material was the most consequential decision. The monometal pistons, the high-nickel alloy of exceptional durability that had been the standard in B&H instruments across decades, were replaced with stainless steel. Stainless steel was cheaper. It was not wrong as a valve material in any obvious way. It worked. The instrument played. But Monel metal, over decades of use, maintained its surface smoothness in a way that stainless steel did not. Where Monel wore to a consistent, low-friction action that improved with use, stainless steel degraded in a way that introduced a finite life into every instrument that carried it. Dennis Wedgwood identified this decision as the moment B&H put an expiry date on its own product. An instrument that was designed to last a player's lifetime was now designed, whether anyone intended it or not, to need replacement within a predictable span of years. The bell metal deteriorated. The thickness and alloy specification of the brass used for bells, the component that, more than any other, determines the resonance and tonal character of the instrument, was reduced to manage material costs. The craftsmen in the bell shop knew the difference. They could hear it in the ring. The instruments that came off the line in the 1980s and early 1990s still worked. They were not obviously inferior to a casual buyer, but to the experienced player who put a 1975 sovereign beside a 1990 sovereign and played them both, something had been lost in the metal, and no amount of polish concealed it. The hydraulic expansion process that Arthur Blakely had developed in the 1930s, designed to form the bows and curves of brass tubing with a precision that preserved the internal geometry of the air column, was deployed in the later years on instruments whose material could not fully respond to it. Work-hardened metal that had not been correctly annealed came out of the process with stress built into the curves, stress that affected the way the metal vibrated and therefore the way the instrument sounded. The process was correct. The material wasn't cooperating, and by the time anyone with sufficient authority and sufficient knowledge was prepared to say so clearly, the knowledge to address it was already thinning out. The BBC's Watchdog programme arrived somewhere around 1999. The specific date varies in the accounts that survive, but the fact is consistent. The silver plating that B&H was applying to its finished instruments, applied, as one worker would later describe it, as much to conceal the inadequate finish of the underlying brass as to decorate it, was failing in service. Instruments bought new, played for months, returning to dealers with the plating lifting and peeling and separating from the base metal in ways that should never happen to new work. The programme that was supposed to expose consumer failures in products across the market found, in B&H instruments, something that warranted national television attention. that this was happening at all, that the manufacturer of instruments that had served the Kneller Hall fanfare trumpets and the Royal Military School of Music, and the finest contesting brass bands in the world, was appearing on a consumer complaint program, was, to anyone who remembered the early 1970s, a form of institutional degradation that no production statistics could adequately capture. And in the brass shop, on certain days, it was raining. The roof of the main production building had deteriorated to the point where, during significant rainfall, water accumulated in the roof and found its way down through the structure to the shop floor below. Workers in the brass shop, the department that did the most technically demanding work, where the material and the process demanded consistency of environment as much as consistency of skill, were working, on those days, in 4 inches of standing water. Instruments being made in conditions that no responsible manufacturer would have tolerated, in a building maintained at a standard that its peak-era management would not have recognized as consistent with the name above the gate. The name was still there. The Sonorous Works. The factory named for sound. The roof had a different opinion. Chapter 9. The Accounts Department takes control. The decision to outsource had not arrived as a single moment of policy. It had crept in, as outsourcing decisions tend to, through the language of pragmatism. This component can be sourced more cheaply externally. This instrument, in low volume, is not viable to manufacture in-house at current costs. This category of product can be brought in from a partner manufacturer and sold under the B&H name at a margin that the in-house production cannot match. Each individual decision of this kind was on its own terms defensible. The product range was genuinely enormous, mind-boggling, as management had described it in the early 1970s, and not every item in it could be produced at scale and at quality without continuous investment in the specific tooling and specific expertise that each item required. The German-made components that began arriving at Edgware for fitting and finishing were not inherently inferior. The Indian-sourced trumpets that appeared in the later years were the result of a calculation that somebody, somewhere in the organization, had approved on the basis of unit cost. The problem was not the first outsourcing decision. The problem was what outsourcing required of the workers who remained. When German-made components arrived at Edgware for assembly, they did not always fit. The tolerances of a German manufacturing process, calibrated to German tooling and German dimensional standards, met the tolerances of Edgware's assembly process and did not always agree. Workers who had spent careers making components whose dimensions they controlled from the beginning, who knew, because they had made it, that a valve casing was within specification, were now receiving components whose dimensions had been determined somewhere else, by someone else's equipment, without reference to the specific requirements of the Edgware assembly line. The result was rework. Workers took components designed to fit a particular instrument and modified them. With the skill they had, with the knowledge they had, bending the fit into acceptable territory, so that an instrument could be completed and dispatched. This was not ideal manufacturing. It was remedial manufacturing. It was the factory becoming, as Dennis Wedgwood observed, with the precision of someone who had watched it happen, not a production house, but a rework shop. The Indian-sourced trumpets arrived in conditions that were, by any standard the Edgware workforce applied, unacceptable. One worker described years later the production methods he understood to be in use. Workers laying on their sides on the floor to form the instrument bodies, a manufacturing posture that suggested a complete absence of the tooling and fixturing that proper brass instrument production required. Almost everything that arrived from India had to be rejected or extensively reworked before it could be assembled into a finished instrument. The rejection rate was not a quality anomaly. It was the cost of a sourcing decision that had been made by people who were not close enough to the production reality to understand what they were agreeing to. The workers told management, "This is the detail that needs to be clearly stated and clearly understood, because it determines the moral character of what happened." The people on the shop floor, the workers whose hands were in contact with the instruments and the materials every day, who could feel when something was wrong before they could articulate why, told management about the problems. They identified the desoldering solution that was being used in the finishing process as a cause of the silver plating failures. They flagged the quality issues with the outsourced components. They described what they were seeing and recommended that it be addressed. They were not listened to. The accounts department was running the instrument division. Dennis Wedgwood's diagnosis, Never mind the instrument's primary purpose, its sound. Let's just try and make it look nice and shiny and flog it as quickly as possible, describes a management philosophy that had arrived at the specific inversion of what the factory had been built to do. The Sonorous Works had been named for sound. The management of its final decade had decided that sound was not the metric by which success was measured. Appearance was, throughput was, cost reduction was. These are not unreasonable things to measure in a manufacturing operation. They become catastrophic when they are the only things measured by people who have never played the instruments they are measuring them by. The wisdom that the Edgware workforce preserved, in fragments and sayings and the accumulated common sense of people who had watched companies fail before, contained a specific diagnosis of this condition. Dennis Wedgwood quoted it. "The death of a company is when management has got rid of the old gaffer who could remember trying something 20 years before that didn't work. The old gaffers, the engineers and craftsmen who carried the institutional memory, who remembered why the Manel metal had been chosen in the first place, who understood what a properly annealed brass sheet felt like under the forming tool, had been retiring through the 1970s and 1980s, and they were not being replaced by people of equivalent knowledge. They were being replaced, in the management structure, by people who understood the cost of materials without understanding the consequence of changing them. The lottery windfall, when it arrived in the mid to late 1990s, should have been a rescue. The National Lottery had, since its launch in 1994, been distributing heritage and educational grants to schools and cultural institutions across Britain, and the instrument hire market received a significant injection of new demand as schools used grant money to buy instruments they could not otherwise have afforded. The orders came in. The factory could not fulfill them at quality. The instruments went out anyway. A generation of lottery-funded school purchases received B&H instruments that should not have left the building. The silver plating that had appeared on Watchdog. The stainless steel valves with their finite operating life. The bells made from material that did not ring with the authority that the Blakely-era instruments had rung with. Children across Britain who had received lottery grant money to start music received instruments that were less than the instruments their parents' generation had learned on, branded with the same name, carrying the same authority, and already beneath the polish, failing in ways that would become apparent within years rather than decades. The factory had been selling something it no longer fully knew how to make, and the customers who received it did not, in most cases, know enough to know what they had missed. They would find out when the instruments began to fail. Somewhere around this period, Dennis Wedgwood made what would be his last visit to the Deansbrook Road site. He arrived at the gate. The gatekeeper, he would later recount, looked at his car, a BMW, and told him, without warmth, that motorbikes went round the back. He had been coming to this factory for decades. He had come as a 17-year-old to hear the Anvillian chimes of the bell-making shop. He had come as an experienced player and craftsman in the years of the Sovereign's peak quality to see what British instrument-making could do at its finest. He had come, more recently, because the factory was still there, and because he could not quite stop coming. The gatekeeper's sneer was not a personal insult. It was a symptom. "The disease," Wedgwood would write, "has finally spread to the factory gate." The institutional pride that had given the building its name, the Sonorous Works, the factory that had named itself for sound, had gone. What remained was a factory in its last years, stripped of quality and confidence, still turning out instruments under a name that no longer fully described what it was doing. Chapter 10. Chicago. The Chicago operation had existed for a long time. Boosey and Company had maintained a New York presence since 1892. Over a century of transatlantic commercial relationship, the American office managed through successive generations of staff who understood both the British parent company and the specific requirements of the American market. During the Second World War, when Ralph Hawkes had relocated to New York to pursue the publishing acquisitions that would define the firm's international standing, the American arm had grown substantially. The publishing and instrument businesses in America operated as distinct entities, the publishing through New York and the instrument distribution through the Chicago office of Boosey and Hawkes Incorporated. The Chicago operation was, in its essential nature, a distribution business. It took the instruments manufactured or sourced by B&H and sold them into the American market. It was dependent on the parent company for its product and operated within a management structure that ultimately reported to London. From London, it looked like a revenue line. Orders placed, shipments made, invoices raised, income recorded. A distribution business that reports sales figures to a distant parent company operates within a specific kind of structural vulnerability. The figures that travel back to London across 4,000 miles of Atlantic are numbers on a page. The people in London reading those numbers cannot easily verify whether the sales they represent actually happened. They cannot visit the customers. They cannot check the invoices against physical deliveries. They can apply audit procedures, and they did periodically, in the way that large organizations manage their overseas subsidiaries. But the daily operational scrutiny of whether a sale was real was not, in practice, being exercised. What the evidence suggests, and here the record is incomplete because the individuals involved have never been publicly named and the detailed forensic account of the fraud has not entered the public domain, is that a small number of sales staff within the Chicago distribution operation began entering sales that had not occurred. False invoices, fictitious customers, orders recorded in the system that had never been placed by a real buyer and would never be fulfilled because there was no real buyer to receive them. The motive was, in all probability, straightforward. Salespeople whose compensation and career progression were tied to the sales figures they achieved had a structural incentive to make those figures say what needed to be said, and the distance from London reduced the probability of detection. The mechanism of the fraud was not, by the standards of corporate malfeasance, elaborate. It did not require sophisticated financial engineering or the complicity of senior accounting staff. It required people entering numbers into a sales system that they knew to be false, in the reasonable confidence that the numbers would be transmitted to London and accepted as reflecting something that had happened. It was, as one worker who lived through the consequences later described it, a couple of salesmen in the American distribution office who ripped the company off with fake sales. The losses, when the auditors found the gap, totaled £13 million. £13 million in revenue that had been reported and acted upon and incorporated into the financial position that the B&H board and shareholders understood the company to hold, and that did not exist. £13 million is not the kind of sum that a company can absorb quietly and continue as before. For Boosey Hawkes plc, a publicly listed company already managing the reduced profitability of an instruments division in structural decline, £13 million written off in a single quarter was a catastrophic correction. The share price responded accordingly. It happened just before Christmas, 1999. The workers at Edgware knew something had happened because the atmosphere changed, in the way that the atmosphere of a workplace always changes, when the people at the top of the organization have received news that the people further down the structure haven't been told yet. Something was wrong. The specific nature of wrong was not announced, but the working world of the Sonorous Works, in January 2000, had a different quality than it had had in November 1999, and the people who worked there felt it. In 2001, Boosey Hawkes was put up for sale. The board's position was not sustainable. The share price had collapsed. The £13 million write-off had removed whatever financial margin the company had retained, and the Edgware site, the large North London landholding, the purpose-built factory that Ralph Hawkes had commissioned in 1924, the buildings that had housed 700 workers and the 8-foot tuba and the Sonorous Works sign, was the most valuable asset the company had. Its value was not as a factory, it was as a development site, in a borough of London where residential property prices had been rising continuously, and where a large piece of land with planning potential was worth a very specific amount of money to a property developer. That amount, the board determined, was £17 million. The factory was sold. £17 million. That is the figure at which 76 years of continuous operation, the factory that Ralph Hawkes had built to manufacture the British Empire's instruments, that had made Lancaster bomber parts and euphoniums and Spitfire components and 1,000 instruments a week, that had employed the children of the people it had employed before, that had been named for the sound of what it made, was valued by the market in 2001. £17 million of North London land. The buildings would come down. Housing would go up. And the name above the gate, which had been there since 1925, would come down with the buildings. Production, such as it was transferred to a smaller facility in Croxley, Watford, specifically the Croxley Industrial Estate, a site that had none of the Edgware infrastructure, none of the Edgware equipment calibrated for the specific work. and none of the institutional knowledge that had moved out of the building with the workers who chose not to follow the operation 20 miles northwest. The man put in charge of the Watford transition was named Michael Winter. He had come from a German case manufacturer. He had no deep background in instrument production. He did not visit the new site. This last detail requires a moment's attention because it is the detail that explains, more clearly than any other single fact, the nature of what had become of the management of Britain's greatest instrument-making operation. The person responsible for moving a complex precision manufacturing process from an established site to a new facility, responsible for ensuring that the tooling arrived and was correctly installed, that the process flows were reconfigured to fit the new building, that the components from the various sources would actually work together at the new location, did not visit the new location. He managed it from wherever he was, by whatever information reached him, without the direct physical knowledge of the site that any competent manufacturing manager would have considered the most basic requirement of the job. The consequences were immediate and exactly what anyone who had visited the Watford site in advance could have predicted. The parts did not fit. The components sourced from Germany for assembly at Watford had been calibrated to Edgware's tooling, and Watford had different tooling, and the difference meant that assembly required rework that the reduced workforce could not efficiently provide. New tooling was needed. The company could not afford new tooling. The workers who had followed the operation from Edgware found themselves attempting to make instruments in a facility that had not been adequately prepared to receive them, without the equipment they needed, under management that had never seen the building. The Forum Post, written by a former worker in 2006, captures the Watford period in the tone of someone describing something they had known was going to fail before it began. We could not produce the instruments because the parts did not fit. We needed new tooling at Watford, but were told the company could not afford it. I left soon after because I could not see it ever working. His father had given 50 years to the Edgware factory. He had given 20. He walked away from the Watford facility in 2001 because there was nothing left to walk toward. In February 2003, the Instruments division was sold. The music group, operating as Rutland Fund Management, acquired Buffer Crampon, the Hufner guitar brand, and the Besson-branded B&H brass operation for £33,200,000. The instruments were now someone else's problem. In November 2003, H Capital acquired the publishing entity, the catalogue of Stravinsky and Britten and Prokofiev and Rachmaninoff and Strauss and Bernstein and Copland, at an enterprise value of £75 million. The music was worth more than 4 times the instruments that played it. In 2006, Buffet Crampon, the French woodwind company that B&H had purchased in 1981, carefully kept in Paris, deliberately not moved to Edgware, purchased Besson, the renamed B&H brass operation, from the music group. Brass instrument production moved to France. The company B&H had bought to extend its portfolio had outlasted B&H itself, and in the end had absorbed B&H's core instrument legacy and taken it abroad. The French company that had never moved to Edgware inherited everything that had been made there, everything that moved to Watford and failed there, everything that had been the Sonorous Works. In April 2008, the publishing entity was acquired by Imagem, a Dutch company. The Stravinsky and Britten copyrights, the works that Ralph Hawkes had secured by rescuing Ernst Roth from Vienna, by flying to New York, by outbidding rivals for the Kusevitsky estate, were now in Dutch hands. Imagem was later acquired by Concord, an American company. The most valuable catalogue of serious contemporary music in the world now resides in California. Leslie Boosey had spent his career ensuring that British composers were fairly rewarded for their work. The catalogue he helped build, the catalogue that Ralph Hawkes assembled through 2 decades of international vision and personal courage, is now owned by an American entertainment company whose offices are 4,000 miles from 295 Regent Street. Chapter 11. The Last Instrument. The closure of the Deansbrook Road site in 2001 was not a single event. It was a process, months of diminishing activity, of workers given varying amounts of notice and varying amounts of clarity about what was happening and why, of machinery being decommissioned and paperwork being completed, and the daily business of the building gradually unwinding toward a final silence. The 8-foot tuba came down. It had stood at the entrance gate since 1948, more than half a century, watching every worker who had ever arrived at the morning shift, marking the threshold between the North London streets and the world of making that lay beyond. It had been moved there from the Besson Wall in Euston Road when the Besson operation was consolidated at Edgware. It had survived the post-war production boom and the golden age and the scaling back and the deterioration and the watchdog exposé and the flooding brass shop floor, and it had stood at the gate through all of it, still 8 feet of brass confidence, still the factory's announcement to the world about the scale of what it aspired to make. Now it was taken down and put in storage and eventually transferred to the Horniman Museum in Forest Hill, South London, where it sits today in a display case, away from weather and traffic and the judgment of passing workers, in the company of the thousands of other instruments that the museum's curators had been carefully assembling for over a century. The Sentinel of the Sonorous Works, in its final posting, keeps a different kind of watch. The Horniman had been preparing for this. When it became clear that the Boosey Hawkes collection, the instrument museum that Eric McGavin had developed through the 1950s and 1960s, the archive of instrument books and technical drawings and correspondence and photographs that represented 150 years of British instrument-making history, was at risk, the museum moved. With Heritage Lottery Fund grants of £221,500 and a further £10,800 from the Art Fund, the Horniman acquired the collection. Over 8,000 objects in total, the largest single instrument collection in the United Kingdom, materials covering every aspect of the Boosey Hawkes manufacturing history, from the earliest Boosey & Company brass instruments of the mid-Victorian era to the final production records of the Deansbrook Road site. The curator who oversaw the project was Dr. Bradley Strauchan. He met the former B&H staff as an essential part of his research, not as a courtesy, not as archive supplementation, but as the irreplaceable primary source that no document collection can substitute. The people who had worked in the brass shop, the bell-making department, the wood mill, the valve-fitting benches, they were the living library of the knowledge that the factory had carried. Bob Alloway, who had been the engineer in charge of the wood mill, Dennis Lofthouse and Stuart Benzie, both former B&H employees whose recollections informed the academic research into the manufacturing process. The unnamed workers who came to the Horniman and described what they had done, what they had made, what they had known and not been listened to when they tried to explain it. Dr. Strauchan described what he understood the project to be. When I started work on this project, it was about the great Boosey Hawkes legacy and ensuring it was recorded for future generations. The exhibition that opened at the Horniman on November 17, 2006, Sound Designs, The Story of Boosey and Hawkes, displayed for the first time for a public audience the full scope of what had been built and what had been lost. The instruments, the archive, the photographs of the factory at work and the workers at their stations, the instrument books recording the names of individual craftsmen beside the serial numbers of the instruments they had made. The multi-generational families who had given their working lives to Deansbrook Road did not march in protest when the site was sold. There was no high-profile campaign, no parliamentary debate, no front-page coverage in the national press that sustained public attention for more than a day or two. The closure of the Sonorous Works happened in the context of 2001, the year of the September 11th attacks, the year of the Rover crisis, a year dense with other claims on public attention, and it was absorbed, as most British industrial closures are absorbed, into the general narrative of deindustrialisation that had been underway since the 1970s, and that produced, by the early years of the new century, a kind of numbered exhaustion in the communities it touched. Not indifference. Exhaustion. Too many factories had closed for each new closure to receive the attention that any individual one deserved. The workers who had spent careers at Edgware dispersed into the North London labour market. Some found work in the engineering sector that the borough still sustained. Some retired. Some carried the skills they had developed, the knowledge of metal and forming, and the specific tolerances of musical instrument manufacture, into workshops that had nothing to do with instruments. The knowledge that cannot be written down went with them, and when they retired or died, it went further. The Sonorous Works, the sign on the building, the name in the company literature, the declaration of purpose that had faced Deansbrook Road since Ralph Hawkes had built the factory, came down with the building. The machines were sold or scrapped. The tools were dispersed. The specific tooling that had been calibrated to the specific instruments that Edgware produced, the dies for the cornet bell, the forms for the euphonium bow, the valve casing mandrels that held the correct bore diameter for the sovereign, was gone. When Michael Winter at Watford said there was no money for new tooling, He was saying that the accumulated physical intelligence of 76 years of instrument making was irreplaceable, because the budget to replace it did not exist. He was right about that part. Everything else he was wrong about, but he was right about that. Chapter 12. Deansbrook Road. The houses went up quickly. The site on Deansbrook Road that Barnet Council eventually consented to develop was large enough for a significant number of residential units, and the developer who had paid £17 million for it had a straightforward financial interest in turning it into homes as efficiently as the planning process permitted. The former internal roads of the Sonorous Works became, in the planning documentation, access routes to a residential development. The yard where the 8-foot tuba had stood at the entrance became presumably a driveway or a garden fence or a strip of pavement alongside the new houses. There is a plaque on the site. Local records confirm it. It marks, in the way that such plaques mark things, that something was here before. It does not rise, by any account of people who have visited the site, to the level of institutional recognition that the Sonorous Works warranted, the kind of recognition that a building of genuine national cultural significance receives when it is lost, the kind that requires visitors to pause and understand what the marker represents. It is a plaque. It says something happened here. Then it returns you to the street. The Besson brand, under which B&H instruments had been sold through much of the final decade of operation, the name that had been absorbed into B&H in 1968 and had carried the tradition of British brass wind manufacture into the new century, is now manufactured in France. Buffet-Crampon, based in Paris and Mantes-la-Ville, produces Besson instruments to the same professional standard that the sovereign name once represented in the contesting brass band world. The French company is good at this. The instruments are excellent. They are made in France. The regent name, the imperial name, the sovereign name. These survive on the second-hand market, in the hands of dealers like John Packer, who handle pre-owned brass instruments as a specialism. The instruments they are selling, the regent cornets from the 1970s, the imperial tubas from the early 1980s, the sovereigns from the early 1990s when the quality was at its highest, are sought after precisely because they were built when the factory still cared. A vintage sovereign in good condition commands a premium, not because the current market lacks alternatives, because the people who know the difference between an instrument made with full attention and an instrument made with divided attention can tell, from the weight of the piston action and the depth of the bell ring, which one this is. The 1010 clarinet, the wide-bore B and H woodwind instrument of the Golden Age, has become a collector's instrument, sought by players who want the particular response that its dimensions provide. An instrument that was once a production line school clarinet is now a vintage find, restored and valued for the qualities that the factory was building into it routinely and without self-consciousness in the years when it still knew how. The Regent euphonium, whose serial number dates it to 1921, made in the Boosey and Company workshops, before the merger, before Edgware, before the Sovereign and the BBC Watchdog and the flooding brass shop, is, by the account of the player who owns it, still in playing condition. Recently refurbished, playing in tune, it might reach 100 years old still in service. It has already outlasted the factory that made it by a quarter century. The instrument the factory was ashamed of, at the end, the heavy old Regent that the accounts department considered insufficiently glamorous, will outlive the factory by more than a century if it continues at its current pace. That seems about right. The publishing catalogue, the Stravinsky and the Britten and the Prokofiev and the Rachmaninoff, the Richard Strauss Four Last Songs and the Bernstein and the Copland, is administered by Concord, an American company headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee, that acquired Imagem in 2017. The scores that Ernst Roth brought from Vienna, the rights that Ralph Hawkes purchased from Kusevitsky's estate, the catalogue that Leslie Boosey helped build and that Britain never properly recognized him for building, these are American assets. They will continue to generate royalties for as long as orchestras perform. The Rite of Spring and conductors put the War Requiem in their programs and sopranos prepare Via Letzterlieder for their recitals. They will do so under American ownership, at a distance from 295 Regent Street that the founders of the firm would have found both astonishing and saddening in equal measure. The Regent Street address itself was vacated in 2005, 131 years, from 1874 to 2005, and then the number 295 belonged to someone else. There is nothing there now that marks the connection. British instrument making, in the assessment of the academic researchers who documented the Edgware story, has returned to the condition it was in before Boosey and Company arrived at scale. Small specialist makers, craft workshops, individual luthiers and metal workers producing instruments of the highest quality for discriminating buyers, in the way that instrument making was organized across most of the world before industrialization made mass production possible. London musical instruments, Smith Watkins, workshops of excellence, each one the result of an individual maker's commitment. What B&H consolidated and produced at scale for a century and a half, the idea that the finest British instrument making could be available to anyone who walked into a music shop or applied to their local education authority, is gone. The workshop age has returned. The factory age is over. Chapter 13. The Regent in the Attic. Somewhere, in a cupboard or an attic or the back of a wardrobe in a house in Britain, there is a Regent euphonium in its original case. Black leatherette overboard. The mouthpiece in its recess. The cleaning rod alongside it. The instrument itself, heavy, slightly dented, a little tarnished at the bell where the lacquer has worn through to the brass underneath, still essentially what it was when it left the Deansbrook road gates on whatever morning in whatever year of the 1960s or 1970s or 1980s the production records would show. The person who bought it may no longer play. The person who was given it as a child may have lost touch with music decades ago or found it again. The instrument has been waiting in its case through school terms and house moves and the ordinary accumulation of a life spent partly thinking about other things. It still plays, not merely plays in tune. The compensating valve system, the solution that David James Blakely worked out in his Boosey workshop in 1874, patented at a moment when the Industrial Revolution was still in full confidence and the empire was still expanding and the brass band world was still an institution of mass culture rather than a beloved specialism, still does exactly what it was designed to do. The pistons, if they are properly oiled and the instrument has been stored without damage, still work with a smoothness that modern instruments replicate but do not improve upon. The bell, if the alloy of that particular instrument was the high copper brass of the factory's best years, still rings with a depth that you can feel in the chest of the person playing it. The instrument in the attic does not know that the factory is gone. It does not know that the site on Deansbrook Road is housing now, that the Sovereign brand is produced in France, that the publishing catalogue lives in Nashville. It is an instrument. It does what it was made to do. It will continue to do it for as long as someone takes it out of the case and applies breath and embouchure and the particular human commitment that the instrument requires of its player in exchange for everything it gives back. The 8-foot tuba is at the Horniman Museum in Forest Hill. The instrument collection and archive, 8,000 objects, the accumulated physical record of 150 years of British instrument making, is there too, catalogued and preserved and available to researchers and curators and anyone who visits the museum with the particular interest in understanding what the Sonorous Works was. Dr. Strauchen's exhibition told the story. The instrument books, with their penciled names of individual engravers and their serial numbers and their dates, can be consulted. The wartime photographs, the women at the sticky bomb assembly tables, the Lancaster components in the workshops where euphoniums were being made 6 months before and would be made again 6 months later, are preserved. The postcard from Jack Brymer to Eric McGavin. The photograph of McGavin demonstrating the cornu to the Hemel Hempstead Grammar School students. The 8-foot tuba, which stood for 53 years at the Deansbrook Road entrance and witnessed to every worker who ever arrived at the morning shift, now stands in a museum case and witnesses something different. The Leslie Boosey Award is presented every 2 years by the Royal Philharmonic Society and the Performing Rights Society, the institution where Leslie Boosey and Ralph Hawkes first sat down together in the 1920s and agreed that their firm's futures were better combined than separate. The award goes, explicitly and by design, to someone who has contributed to British musical life in ways that attract no public attention. Backstage people, people who made things possible for others. People who understood, as Leslie Boosey understood, that the music matters more than the applause that follows it. The man who helped build the most valuable serious music catalogue in the world died in 1979 without a newspaper obituary. His name survives in recognition of people who don't take curtain calls. There is a rightness to this that goes beyond sentiment. What the Sonorous Works built, the compensating valve, the sovereign on the contest stage, the regent in the school stockroom, the Lancaster pipes and the sticky bombs and the Spitfire components and the return to euphoniums when the war was over, was a form of argument, an argument that quality and scale were not incompatible, that making 1,000 instruments a week and making them right were not different things, that the sound a child produced on their first instrument and the sound a professional produced on their finest were worth the same level of commitment from the people who built them, because the music those sounds would eventually make was worth that commitment. The argument was eventually lost. Not through catastrophe, not through a single decision, a single fraud, a single moment when someone chose ruin over survival. Through the slow, accumulated weight of smaller choices, the Monel metal replaced with stainless steel, the physicist not replaced when he left, the gatekeeper who sneered at a car rather than recognizing a craftsman arriving to see what he had helped build. The salesmen in Chicago finished it, but they didn't start it. The long retreat had been underway for a quarter of a century before anyone in a Chicago distribution office entered a number that wasn't real. The instruments that lasted, the Regent euphonium from 1921, the early sovereign that a contesting band principal still plays, the 1010 clarinet that found its second life as a vintage instrument, lasted because the people who made them were still making them the way the people before them had made them, in the years when the knowledge was intact and the roof didn't leak and the management hadn't yet decided that sound was less important than cost. Those instruments are in attics and cases and instrument rooms and museum displays, all over Britain. They are patient. They are waiting for breath, for hands, for the particular human willingness to make music from metal that the people of Deansbrook Road spent a century enabling. They will wait for as long as it takes.